everybody, thank you so much for joining me today on the My Bourbon Journey Whiskey Review channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at, personally, one of my favorite rye whiskeys from Wild Turkey. This is the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Kentucky Straight Rye Whiskey. So mouthful, but again, you'll see fantastic rye whiskey. And again, another rye that I think is a must-have in anybody's kind of collection or your bar cart, whatever it may be. So again, this is the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Rye. Comes in at 104 proof or 52% ABV. Mash bill on this, again, it's going to qualify as the barely legal rye whiskey. Mash bill is going to be 51% rye, 37% corn, 12% malted barley. It is non-age stated, and the MSRP on this one is also right around that $55 price point. So this is, again, another one of those ryes that falls within that kind of that category or within that price range of that $50 to $60 price range that just offers a huge bang for your buck, and hopefully you'll see that today. So, all right, let's go ahead and we'll kind of get into the initially the color. So, all right, so as you can see, not overly dark, but a nice kind of copper. More importantly than the color is I like to move the whiskey around in the glass a little bit. It gives you an idea of maybe how oily it is. And if you can see this glass, I mean, it is like an oil streak everywhere. So that's one thing I really like to see in a whiskey is that it's nice and oily. Hopefully that will translate over to the palate when it's coating it and all of that. So, you know, it's important to me so that, again, like I said before, when you see that it's nice and oily, again, that will allow a lot of just those flavors to remain on the palate, which just helps to make the whiskey much more flavorful. So, all right, let's go ahead and get into the nose. So right away, it's the first thing you kind of pick up with this is the oak presence. It's not overly, you know, tannic or heavy on the oak, but it lets you know there's a nice amount of oak that's there. Nice black pepper note. And this is a little bit more of what I kind of term the pungent rye. So I'm going to say this is going to be more of a rye drinker's rye from the standpoint of just what it has to offer. I don't think, you know, and again, I've had these before, but overall, you know, it's a really nice nose. But again, it lends itself to more dominant rye notes. Again, a little bit of that leather tobacco note. Still some nice vanillas that are there. And then there's also something, this is where you'll pick up a little bit of the sweetness. There's almost like this, like fudge brownie aspect to it. Just not a super sweet fudge brownie, if that makes sense. It's just, there's some sweetness that's there, but again, this is more dominant by the rye that's there, more so than the corn influence in this one. Again, I just kind of, you know, qualify this one as a little bit more of a rye drinker's rye. A little bit of corn that's on this one. I'll say as far as the corn in this, I would say this is probably much more of a cornbread where it's not overly sweet, but it's letting you know there's a corn presence that's there. And this is kind of interesting. From a fruit standpoint, there's kind of some lighter fruits, but more specifically like a honeydew, something along those lines. Or like a monk fruit, something like that. Interesting. A touch of mint on it as well. Really nice nose. You know, and this is one thing. I'm a huge fan of you know, Wild Turkey, what they do, the Russell's line. I mean, I think it offers an awfully great value for what it is that they're putting out, and I think we'll see that today as we get into the taste part of it. So why don't we dive into that now, and we'll see what this one is going to taste like. So cheers. So this is like rye right in your face. Like it lets you know it's a rye whiskey. Even though it's barely rye whiskey, it's a heavy rye influence. Followed quickly again by that oak presence, maybe slightly sweet oak. Again, more of the heavier notes. So you got the tobaccos, the leathers, some slight corn sweetness that's there. Still some of the vanillas, the caramels, things along those lines, but that rye becomes way more dominant. It's much more of that pungent rye like you would get from like a rye bread. It's much more along those lines than you're picking up a lot of the sweetness part of it. Definitely some of that black pepper, and it's probably heavier pepper on this one. Still some mint aspect to it as well. Maybe a touch of citrus. This probably I would describe more of a lemon type of citrus than anything. It's just much more, I don't want to say sour, but it's just much more, I don't want to make this sound bad, like much more of a pungent type of aspect to it. It's just a heartier rye whiskey from that standpoint. So that's probably a better analogy, is that, you know, it's just heartier, I would say. So this probably is something that lends itself to one of those kind of cold evenings where you're sipping on a nice rye whiskey. This can fall definitely in that category. So definitely some cinnamon notes that are there as well. That oak kind of really lingers. It's a sweeter oak, I would say, but still followed quickly by that more aggressive rye, that heartier rye, maybe a rye bread, black pepper, still some of those vanillas and caramels, but it's much heavier on that side of it from a standpoint of it just being a heartier rye. So this is a good example of if you take the opposite of like a Pikesville, where Pikesville is much more on the sweeter side, and very typical, or excuse me, very similar mash bill. So both 51% rye, slight difference in the corn and malted barley, but two completely different profiles on these. So this again, I'm gonna just say that it's much more of a, like I said before, a rye drinker's rye, much heartier, maybe a little bolder from those standpoint, less sweet notes and more of, again, the heartier type of notes. Yeah, again, more of those leathers, tobaccos, still a little bit of mint that's on this one as well. Maybe a slight chocolate note, I would say, on that, more of like a baker's chocolate. There's just not a ton of sweetness on this. It's definitely there. I mean, I don't want you to think that this is just, you know, a straight like, you know, herb bomb or anything like that, or very tannic. It's not that. There's still some lingering sweetness. I just want you to understand what it is that you're going to be getting. So if you're okay with a rye whiskey that drinks a little bit more heavier on the rye aspect and less sweet, this may be right up your alley. A nice comparison would probably be, or the opposite would be like a Pikesville, where it's definitely on the sweeter side, less of those rye influences that are there. So that's just the difference, you know, in what this has to offer. Finish wise, I would say it definitely has that lingering spice that's there. So there's definitely that lingering, you know, rye, you know, spice. You know, again, a little bit maybe of that herbal characteristic. Definitely black pepper. The mint has been there kind of throughout. So that's the nice part about a nice rye whiskey. So if I get some of the mint versus the dill side, I prefer that much more for my palate. And I'm picking up definitely more mint than really any dill on this one. So, you know, finish wise, again, I'd say this is probably on the medium to longer side, only because of the lingering rye spice that's there. Again, it's a little bit more dominant. So it's in your face, letting you know that this is a rye whiskey. I think a lot of people who would sip on this may not necessarily think that this is a 51% rye mash bill, and it definitely is that. But aside from that, that's kind of my take on the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel. Now, again, remember, it is a single barrel, so there's a chance that it's going to, differ slightly from barrel to barrel. But again, from what these typically have to offer, it's very tried and true. They're very similar in profile for the most part. So there you have it. So again, Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Straight Rye Whiskey, fantastic rye, as long as you know that this is going to drink a little bit heavier on the rye side of things, be a little bit more, pungent, a little more dominant from that standpoint, little less sweetness. So there you have it. Again, Russell's Reserve Single Barrel, 104 proof, $55 rye whiskey. And to me, I think it's still a great value for what it is. So hopefully that helps you a little bit if you were interested in knowing a little bit more about the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel. There you have it. So want to say thank you so much for tuning into another one of my reviews. Greatly appreciate that. Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Good, bad, indifferent, whatever it may be. Love to hear people's feedback as to, your thoughts on the particular whiskey that I'm reviewing today. So with that being said, if you'd like to follow me, you can on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those places at My Bourbon Journey. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can through my Patreon page, which I'll have linked in the description below. In addition to that, it also allows you to become part of the Mash and Journey Whiskey Club. Jason from the Mash and Drum and I kind of teamed up to create a whiskey club, and we do a lot of picks, get people involved. So if those things are of interest to you, consider becoming a part of the whiskey club. So remember, it's about the journey and not the destination. Cheers.